chapter C.10.4 of the Anarchist FAQ. Does growth automatically mean people are better off? In the above sections, we have discussed the effects of neoliberal reforms purely in terms of economic statistics such as growth rates and so on. This means we have critiqued capitalism in its own terms, in terms of supporters' own arguments in its favor. As shown in terms of equality, social mobility, and growth, the rise of freer market capitalism has not been all its supporters have asserted. Rather than produce more equality, less poverty, and increased growth, the opposite has occurred. Where some progress on these areas have occurred, such as Asia, the countries have not embraced the neoliberal model. However, there is a deeper critique to be made of the notion that capitalism benefits everyone, especially the poor. This relates to the quality of life rather than the quantity of money available. This is extremely important to the question of whether the freer market capitalism will result in everyone being better off. The typical capitalist tendency is to consider quantitative values as being the most important consideration. Hence, concern over economic growth, profit levels, and so on, which dominate discussion of modern life. However, as P.T. Thompson makes clear, this ignores important aspects of human life. Simple points must be made. It is quite possible for statistical averages and human experiences to run in opposite directions. A per capita increase in quantitative factors may take place at the same time as a great qualitative disturbance of people's life, traditional relationships, and sanctions. People may consume more goods and become less happy or less free at the same time. For example, real wages have always advanced, but at the cost of longer hours and greater intensity of labor. In statistical terms, this reproves an upward curve. If families conserve, it might feel like immiseration. Thus, it is perfectly possible to have an improvement in average material standards. At the same time, intensified exploitation, greater insecurity, and increasing human misery. Most people can be better off than their forerunners had been 50 years before. They had suffered and continue to suffer this improvements at catastrophic expense from the making of the English working class. Thompson was specifically referring to the experience of the British Industrial Revolution on the working class, but his analysis of general note, its relevance goes far beyond evaluating past or current industrialization processes. This means that concentrating on, say, absolute poverty or income growth, as defenders of neoliberalism do, means to ignore the quality of life which this increased income is associated with. For example, a peasant farmer who has to leave his for employment in a factory may consider having bosses dictate his every move, an increased working day and intensity of work more significant than, say, a net increase in his income. And that this farmer may have been driven off his farm as a result of neoliberal or other reform is another factor which has to be taken into account. If so, to suggest another possibility, if health and safety regulations reduce work speeds, then national output will be reduced just as unions will stop firms making their workers labor intensely for longer. However, increased output at the expense of those who do the work is not unproblematic. Real wages may increase, but the cost of longer hours, less safety, and greater intensity of labor. Another obvious example would be the family where the husband gets downsized from a good manufacturing job. He may get a lower-paying service industry job, which forces his wife and perhaps children to get a job in order to make ends meet. Family income may increase slightly as a result, but at a heavy cost to the family and their way of life. Therefore, the standard of living in the abstract may have increased, but to the people in question, they would feel that it had deteriorated considerably. As such, economic growth need not imply rising standards of living in terms the quality of life decreases as income rise. This means, in part, because of the economy work as neoclassical theory demanded. Then people would go on to work not knowing much about how they would be paid, how long they would be employed for, or indeed whether they had a job at all when they got there. If they rented their home, they would not even know whether they had a home to come back to. This is because every price would have to be subject to constant change in order to adjust to equilibrium. Insecurity, in other words, is at the heart of the economy, and this is hardly productive of community or family values, and other expressions used in the rhetoric of the right while they promote an economic system which, in practice, undermines all of these in the name of profit. In other words, while a society may become materially better off over time, it becomes worse off in terms of real wealth. That is, those things which make life worth living. Thus, capitalism has a corrosive effect on human relationships. The pleasure of productive activity, work, genuine freedom for the many, how we treat each other, and so on. The corrosive effects of economics are not limited to simply the workplace, but seep into all other aspects of your life. Even assuming that free market capitalism could generate high growth rates, and that assumption is not borne out in the real world, this is not the end of the matter. How the growth is distributed is also important. The benefits of growth may accumulate to the few rather than to the many. Per capita and average increases may hide a less pleasant reality for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. An obvious example would be a society in which there is a massive inequality where a few are extremely rich and the vast majority are struggling to make ends meet. Such a society could have decent growth rates and per capita and average income may grow. However, if such growth is concentrated at the top in the hands of the already wealthy, the reality is that economic growth does not benefit the many as the statistics suggest. As such, it is important to stress that average growth may not result in a bettering for all sections of society. In fact, there are plenty of instances in which the poor and the majority of the population have been left behind in the era of globalization, even where per capita income has grown. This is not just limited to developing countries. 2 episodes like this occurred in the United States, with data showing that the per capita income of the poor falling from 1979 to 84 and 1989 to 94, while per capita income rose. Overall, the U.S. has seen its median wage and real wages for the bottom 20th of its population fall between 1973 and 1997, while per capita income in the U.S. has risen by 70%. For the median wage and bottom quintile wage to actually fall during the same period is an economic change of momentous proportion from the point of view of the majority of Americans. Mark Weisbrot, Dean Baker, Robert Nyman, and Helen Nita from Growth May Be Good for the Poor, but our IMF and World Bank policy is good for growth. And this is a classic example of society with substantial inequality seeing the benefits of growth accrue to the already rich. To state the obvious, how the benefits and growth are distributed cannot be ignored. In addition, consumerism may not lead to the happiness or the better society, which many economists imply to be its results. If consumerism is an attempt to fill an empty line, it is clearly doomed to failure. If capitalism results in an alienated, isolated existence, consuming more will hardly change that. The problem lies within the individual and the society in which they live. Hence, quantitative increases in goods and services may not lead to anyone benefiting in any meaningful way. Similarly, there is the issue of the quality of the production and consumption produced by economic growth. Values like GDP do not tell us much in terms of what was produced and its social and environmental impact. Thus, high growth rates could be achieved by the state expanding its armed forces and weaponry, throwing money into arms corporations, while letting society go to rot, as under Reagan. There are awkward facts that Negative social development, such as pollution and rising crime, can contribute to a rising value for GDP. This happens because the cost of cleaning up, say, an oil spill involves market transaction and so gets added to the GDP for an economy. As such, the notion of growth should be rejected in favor of a critical approach to the issues, which asks growth for what and for whom. As Chomsky puts it, many indigenous people apparently do not see a reason why their lives, societies, and cultures should be disrupted or destroyed so that New Yorkers can sit in SUVs in traffic gridlock from failed states. Under capitalism, much productivity is accounted for by economic activity that is described as wasteful. Military spending, expanding police and prison bureaucracies, the spiraling cost of privatized healthcare, suburban sprawl, the fast food industry, and its inevitable ill effects on health, cleaning up pollution, specifying and defending intellectual and other property rights, treating the illnesses caused by overwork, insecurity, and stress. So, as Alexander Berkman once noted, capitalism spawns many forms of work and productive activity which only make sense within that system and could be automatically done away with in a sane society, from what is anarchism. Equally, productivity and living standards can stand at odds with each other. For example, if a country has a lower working week and takes longer holidays, these would clearly depress GDP. This is the case in America and France, which approximately equal productivity, and the latter spends less time in work and more time off. Yet, it takes a capitalist ideologue to say that such a country is worse off as a nation for all that time people spend enjoying themselves. These issues are important to remember when listening to free market gurus discussing economic growth from their gated communities, insulated from the surrounding deterioration of society and nature caused by the workings of capitalism. In other words, quality is often more important than quantity. This leads to the important idea that some, even many of the requirements for a truly human life cannot be found on any market, no matter how free it may be. Equally, a free market can lead to unfree people, as they drive themselves to submit to the authority of bosses to do economic pressures under the threat of unemployment. So it can be said that laissez-faire capitalism will benefit all, especially the poor, only in the sense that it can potentially benefit as an economy increases in size. Of course, the mantra that economic growth is so wonderful is hard to justify when the benefits of that growth are being enjoyed by a small proportion of the people, and the burdens of growth, such as rising job insecurity, loss of benefits, wage stagnation, and declines for the majority of workers, declining public services, loss of local communities, and so forth, are being borne by so many, as is the case with the more to freer markets from the 1980s. If we look at actually existing capitalism, we can start to draw some conclusions about whether a pure laissez-faire capitalism will actually benefit working people. The United States has a small public sector by international standards, and in many ways it is the closest large industrial nation to the unknown idea of pure capitalism. It is also interesting to note that it is also number one or close to it in the following areas, from Richard Duboff in Accumulation of Power. Lowest level of job security for workers, with the greatest chance of being dismissed without notice or reason. Greatest chance for a worker to become unemployed without adequate unemployment and medical insurance. Less leisure time for workers, such as holiday time. One of the most lopsided income distribution profiles. Lowest ratio of female to male earnings. In 1987, 64% of the male wage. Highest incidence of poverty in the industrial world. Among the worst ranking of all advanced industrial nations for pollution emissions into the air. High murder rates. Worst ranking for life expectancy and infant mortality. It seems strange that the more laissez-faire system has the worst job security, least leisure time, highest poverty rate, and inequality of laissez-faire will especially benefit the poorer working people. In fact, we find the more free market the regime, the worse it is for workers. Americans have longer hours and shorter holidays than Western Europeans, and more people live in poverty. 22% of American children grow up in poverty, which means that it ranks 22nd out of the 23 industrialized nations, ahead of only Mexico and behind all 15 of the pre-2004 European Union countries. According to the 2007 United Nations report, the worst places to be your child are in neoliberal societies such as UK and the USA. UK was at the bottom, number 21, one below the US. The UNICEF report deals with the condition of children in advanced capitalist countries and found that both the UK and US are way down the list on education, health, poverty, and well-being. While UNICEF preferred to state that this is because of a dog-eat-dog society, it is hardly a coincidence that these two societies have most embraced the principles of neoliberalism and have repeatedly attacked the labor movement, civil society in general, as well as the welfare state in the interest of capital. In contrast, social democratic Northern European countries which have the best results. One could also point out, for example, that Europeans enjoy more leisure time, better health, less poverty, less inequality, and thus more economic security, greater intergenerational economic mobility, better access to high-quality social services like healthcare and education, and manage to do all that in a far more environmentally sustainable way. Europe generates about half the CO2 emissions for the same level of GDP compared to the US or the UK. A definite case of what is good for the economy, profits, is bad for people. To state the obvious, an economy and the people in that economy are not identical. The former can be doing well, but not the latter, particularly if inequality is skewing distribution of any rising income. So while the economy may be doing well, its median participants and below may see very little of it. Of course, defenders of laissez-faire capitalism will point out that the United States, like the UK, and any other real country, is far from being laissez-faire. This is true, yet it seems strange that the further an economy moves from the ideal, better conditions get for those who it is claimed will especially benefit from them. As such, non-believers in pure capitalism have cause for dissent, although the typical market advocate, such comparisons tell us little. Unless they happen to bolster their case, then actually existing capitalism could be used as an example. Ultimately, the real issue to do with the quality of life and relative change. The argument that capitalism helps the poorest most by economic growth is rooted in comparing free market capitalism with historical examples and the notion of absolute inequality rather than relative inequality and poverty. Thus, poverty, economic, cultural, and social in, say, America can be dismissed simply on the grounds that poor people in 2005 have more and better goods than those in 1905. The logic of an absolute position, as intended undoubtedly, is to make even discussing poverty and inequality is pointless, as it is to say that there are no poor people in the West and no one lives in a cave. But then again, using absolute values, it's easy to prove that there were no poor people in medieval Europe, either, as they did not live in caves, compared to hunter-gatherers or the slaves of antiquity. They had much better living standards. As such, any regime would be praiseworthy by the absolute human standard, as even slavery would have been better living standards than, say, the earliest humans. In this respect, the words of Adam Smith are as relevant as ever. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith states the following: "By necessaries I understand not only the commodities which are indispensably necessary for the support of life, but whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even the lowest order of life, to be without. A linen shirt, for example, strictly speaking, is not a necessity of life. The Greeks and Romans lived, I suppose, very comfortably, though they had no linen. But in the present times, through the greater part of Europe, a creditable day laborer would be ashamed to appear in public without a linen shirt, the want of which would be supposed to denote the disgraceful degree of poverty which, it is presumed, nobody can well fall into without extreme bad conduct. Under necessaries, therefore, I comprehend not only those things which nature, but those things which the established rules of decency have rendered necessary to the lowest rank of people. As usual, Adam Smith is right, while his erstwhile ideological followers are wrong. They may object, noting strictly speaking that Smith was talking of necessaries rather than poverty. However, his concept of necessaries implies a definition of poverty, and this is obviously based not on some unchanging biological concept of subsistence, but on whatever the custom of the country or the established rules of decency consider necessary. Marx made the same point in his later works when he distanced himself from his earlier notion that capitalism resulted in absolute impoverishment. As he put in his Volume 1 of Capital, the number and extent of the workers' so-called necessary requirements, as also the manner and extent that they are satisfied, are themselves products of history, and depend therefore to a great extent on the level of civilization attained by a country. In contrast, therefore, with the case of other commodities, the determination of the value of labor power contains a historical and moral element. It is ironic that those today who aggressively identify themselves as disciples of Smith are also the people who are most opposed to definitions of poverty that are consistent with this definition of necessaries. This is unsurprising, as those who invoke his name usually do so in pursuit of ideas alien to his work. This is done for the usual self-interest motives. For example, Thatcher's government originally had little problem with the concept of relative poverty, and only when its policies had led to conspicuous growth of relative poverty was the idea denounced, and the decision taken by the government that absolute poverty, undefinable and unqualified, was the only reality. Ian Gilmore. Smith's perspective, significantly, is that followed by most poverty researchers who use a relative measure in evaluating poverty rates. The reason is unsurprising, as poor is relative to the living standards and customs of a time and place. Some skeptic might regurgitate the unoriginal response that the poor in the West are rich compared to people in developing countries, but they do not live in those countries. True, living standards have improved considerably over time, but comparing the poor of today with those of centuries past is also meaningless. The poor today are poor relative to what it takes to live and develop in their industrial potentialities in their own societies, not in, for example, 18th century Scotland or halfway across the globe. Even Milton Friedman had to grudgingly admit that poverty is in part a relative matter. Considering the harmful effects of relative inequality, we are indicated in section B.1, this position is perfectly justified. The notion of absolute poverty being the key dates back to at least Locke, who argued in his second treatise on government that in America, a king of large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a laborer in England. Ignoring the dubious anthropological assertions, his claim was made as part of a general defense of enclosing common land and turning independent workers into dependent wage slaves. The key to his argument is that the accumulation of property and land beyond that usable is by an individual, along with the elimination of customary rights for poor individuals, was justified because the owners of the enclosed land would hire workers and increase their overall wealth available. This meant that the dispossessed workers, and particularly their descendants, would be better off materially. See B. McPherson's The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism from Hobbes to Locke for an excellent discussion of this. The links with the current debate on globalization are clear, with so-called market advocates and individualists providing extensive apologetics for capital moving to authoritarian regimes which systematically violate individual rights and the principles of free market, and precisely in terms of the increased material wealth this eventually produces. But then it is easy for bosses, tenured professors, as well as paid think tank experts to pontificate that such sacrifices, for others of course, are worth it in the long run. This apparently strange transformation of individualists into collectivists, justifying the violation of human rights to terms of the greater good, has a long precedent. Indeed, it can only be considered strange if you're ignorant of the nature and history of capitalism, as well as the contortions its defenders have inflicted on themselves. And yet, another of these strange coincidences that so regularly afflicts capitalism and its supporters, the individuals whose liberty and rights are considered expendable, are always members of the working class. So the notion of absolute poverty has always been associated with defending inequalities of wealth and power, as well as providing justification in terms of long-term benefit for the violation of the freedom and individual rights they claim to defend. Significantly, the contemporary representatives of the landlords who imposed enclosures framed their arguments precisely in terms of restricting the independence, freedom of the working populations. As Marxist David McNally summarizes after providing extensive quotes, it was precisely these elements of material and spiritual independence that many of the most outspoken advocates of enclosure sought to destroy. They were remarkably forthright in this respect. Common rights and access to common lands, they argued, allowed a degree of social and economic independence and thereby produced the lazy, dissolute mass of rural poor. Denying such people common lands and common rights would force them to conform in the harsh discipline imposed by the market's value against the market. This would only be considered paradoxical if you equate freedom with capitalism. The underlying assumption under all this is that liberty, at least for working class people, is less important than material wealth, a vision rightly attacked when Stalinism seemed to be outperforming the West in terms of growth before the 1970s. Yet the question surely is, would individuals freely agree to be subjected to the dictates of a boss for 10 to 12 hours a day if other alternatives had not been closed off by state intervention? As we discussed in Section F8, the answer has always been no. This is the case today. For example, Naomi Klein interviews one boss of a third world factory sweatshop who explains that for the lowly province worker, working inside an enclosed factory is better than being outside. One of his workers refuted this, stating, "Our rights are being trampled," and then he said that because he has not experienced working in a factory and the conditions inside. Another noted that of course he would say that we prefer this work. It is beneficial to him, but not to us. Another stated the obvious, but we are landless, so we have no choice but to work in the economic zone, even though it is very hard and this situation is unfair. Quoted by Klein and no logo. It should be noted that the boss has, of course, the backing of many great economists, including many moderately left-wing ones, who argue that sweatshops are better than no jobs and that these countries cannot afford basic workers' rights. As these are class societies, it means that their ruling class cannot afford to give these workers the beneficial aspects of a free market, namely the right to organize and associate freely. It is amazing how quickly an economist or right-wing liberal will proclaim that a society cannot expect the luxury of a free market, at least for the working class, and how these individualists will proclaim that the little people must suffer in order for the greater good to be achieved. As for regimes within these factories, Klein notes they are extremely authoritarian. The largest free trade zone in the Philippines is a miniature military state inside a democracy. The management is military style, the supervisors often abusive, as to be expected, no questioning of authority is expected or permitted, and in some, strikes are officially illegal, rather than unofficially banned. As with the original Industrial Revolution, capitalism takes advantage of other forms of social hierarchy in developing countries. As Stephen A. Marglin noted, the women and children, who by all accounts constituted the overwhelming majority of factory workers in the early days, were there not because they chose to be, but because their husbands and fathers told them to be. The application of revealed preference to their presence in the factory requires a rather elastic view of the concept of individual choice. From what do bosses do in the review of radical political economics? In other words, While the workers may be better off in terms of wages, they are not better off in terms of liberty, equality, and dignity. Luckily, there are economists around to explain on their behalf. These workers cannot afford such luxuries. Looking beyond empirical investigation, we should point out that the slave mentality behind these arguments. After all, what does this argument actually imply? Simply that economic growth is the only way for working people to get ahead. If working people put up with exploitative working environments, so the long-run capitalists will invest some of their profits and so increase the economic gain for us all. So, like religion, free market economics argues that we must sacrifice in the short term so that perhaps in the future our living standards will increase. You'll get the pie in the sky when you die, as Joe Hill said about religion. Moreover, any attempt to change the laws of the market, the decisions of the rich, by collective action will only harm the working class. If the dependents of capitalism were genuinely interested in individual freedom, they would be urging the oppressed masses to revolt rather than defending the investing of capital in oppressive regimes in terms of the freedom they are so willing to sacrifice when it comes to work. But of course, these defenders of freedom will be the first to point out that such revolts make for a bad investment climate. Capital will be frightening away companies with a more realistic and flexible workforce, usually made so by state repression. In other words, capitalist economies praise servitude over independence, kowtowing over defiance, and altruism over egoism. The rational person of neoclassical economics does not confront authority, rather he accommodates himself to it. For in the long run, such self-negation will pay off with a bigger cake. It is claimed correspondingly bigger crumbs trickling downwards. In other words, the short term, the gains may float to the elite, but the future, we will all gain something as it will trickle back down to the working people who created them in the first place. But unfortunately, in the real world, uncertainty is the rule and the future is unknown. The history of capitalism shows that economic growth is quite compatible with its stagnating wages, increasing poverty and insecurity for workers and their families, rising inequality and wealth accumulating in fewer and fewer hands. The example of the USA and Chile from the 1970s to 1990s as Chile spring to mind. And of course, even if the workers kowtow to bosses, the bosses may move production elsewhere anyway, as tens of thousands of downsized workers across the West can testify. For more details on this process in the USA, see Edward C. Herman's article Immersing Growth, The First World in Z Magazine, July 1994. For anarchists, it seems strange to wait for a bigger cake when we have the whole bakery. If control of investments was in the hands of those directly affecting working people, then it could be directed into socially and ecologically constructive projects rather than being used as a tool in the class war to make the rich richer. The arguments against rocking the boat are self-serving. It is obvious the interests the rich and powerful to defend a given economy and property distribution, and ultimately self-defeating for those working people who accept them. In the end, even though self-negating working class will suffer from the negative effects of treating society as a resource for the economy, the higher mobility of capital that accompanies growth and effects of periodic economic and long-term ecological crisis. While it boils down to it, you can have two options. You can do what is right, or you can do what you are told. Free market capitalists opt for the latter.